Hey everyone, it's Mr. Hefner again. We're going to move on in our folk tradition unit today, and we're going to start something today that we're going to work on for a few days, and I think you'll find it kind of fun. We're going to take a look at some fairy tales. Now, fairy tales involve medieval settings. They involve magic, often have witches or fairy godmothers or something like that. They often have a lesson for children. But the fairy tales that many of us are familiar with today have been sort of sanitized compared to the original ones. So back in the 18th century, that's the 1700s, there were two university scholars in Germanic Europe by the name of Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. And they went out into the Black Forest and the mountains, and they talked to the local people and asked them to start telling their stories. In all, I should say, the Brothers Grimm collected more than 200 stories that the local people told, and many times they got different versions of the same stories. Now, unlike, you can watch The Frog Princess from Disney or Cinderella or Snow White, and you always get and they lived happily ever after. The truth is, in many fairy tales, they do not live happily ever after. They tend to be very dark. Sometimes they have unfortunate endings. And for children, they can really be very scary. And I think that was part of the idea of the fairy tales. Part of the idea, if you live on the edge of a dark forest, in the 1700s, you can't afford to have your children wandering off deep into that forest. They didn't have search parties. There was no radio tracking or anything like that. And the reality was, if your children went in there, you probably never saw them again. So it's not something where you could let them do it a couple times and slowly teach them. You really had to scare them. Do not go into that forest. And some of these fairy tales were just like that. There were wolves that could eat you, witches that were waiting to fatten you up and eat you. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at one official fairy tale here from the Brothers Grimm. It's from our textbook. We'll talk about that one together. I'm going to have a sort of a Japanese anime adaptation of a fairy tale for you guys to watch. And then we're going to take a bunch of Grimm's Brother fairy tales and we'll divide them up in working groups, and we'll have each group share them. But let's get started with today's introduction to The White Snake, a fairy tale that was collected and written down by the Brothers Grimm. All right, so this is called The White Snake. It was collected by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, but it's a folk tale. They did not write this tale. They wrote it down the way they heard it. And in some cases, when they heard different versions of the same story, they did make decisions about combining them, because ultimately they published 200 stories and they only published one version of each one. But their archival collection has different versions. It is my understanding that there are 16 different versions of the story we know as Cinderella. And some of them end very, very violently. In fact, when we get into groups, at least one of the groups will be reading Aschenputtel, which is one of the stories of Cinderella by a different name. We're going to be looking in this unit again as what are the characteristics of a fairy tale. So we'll be looking for literary terms that match. We'll be looking for elements that show up in a lot of fairy tales as we go. So here's a quick little journal, just a think about. In the story that we're officially going to do, The White Snake, the king grants the hero a favor, one favor. If a powerful person promised you one favor, what would you choose? And this is kind of like a classic old question. If you think of so many different stories that have been passed down, word of mouth, there's often the case of, I will grant you 3 wishes. And of course, the really smart person is always like, well, my first wish would be an infinite number of wishes or something like that. But it's something about human nature. If we could have a wish, what would we wish for? And that's going to be important to the story that we're going to read because it involves wishes. Now, for the reader's resource, I told you some of this here. So many of the fairy tales that you've heard come from the folk tradition. They were written down. There's a really good chance that they fall into these categories that were written by the Grimm brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. They collected these stories in Germany, and then in France, someone by the name of Charles Perrault wrote down some other ones as well. So he collected a story called Cinderella, But the Grimm brothers collected one called Aschenputtel, and they're really the same story with some changes in them. So you will notice that these stories spread, perhaps as people moved and traded and migrated and things like that. All right, so these stories show up in different cultures, in different versions, but they're often the same story that's just changed a bit. This is not a very good image, but there's Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, and you can see that these guys were working mostly in the 18th century, lived well into the 19th century. This is around the time of the American Civil War when both of these gentlemen died. And I've told you everything you know about these, or you need to know about these. They collected them from the people, and then they transcribed them, which means they wrote them down on paper word for word. But when they published them, they combined different stories sometimes to come up with a good publishable version. And as I said, there are 200 of them. So that's quite a few stories that the people of Germanic Europe were telling at the time. The literary tools for this unit that we're going to look for, obviously we're doing a fairy tale now. And so a fairy tale is a story. They often have mischievous, this says spirits, so like witches or elves or something like that can cast spells. They have supernatural things going on, and they're almost always in medieval settings. So they're in the times of kings and queens and things like that. So as we look for this, we're going to look for those elements. And then here's a really good literary term to learn right now. The word is pronounced motif. So even though it looks like motif, it's motif. And a motif is anything that recurs in a piece of artwork. Your definition here says in a literary work, because that's what we're doing. But if you have a fabric, I've seen fabric already with like fish, and the fish repeat all over the fabric. That would be a fish motif. If you had a fabric and, for instance, there's just simply a triangle shape, and triangles are overlapping and in different places throughout the print on the fabric, that's a triangle motif. In literature, a motif can be anything that repeats. So it might be something, it might be something you see, it might be a word, or it might even be something that you hear. So for example, let's take the famous fairy tale of, let's take the Three Little Pigs, right? So there's three pigs, and the first pig builds his house out of, bricks. Another one does straw, and another one does, I don't even remember. But they all build their little huts out of different things. And then when the wolf comes, he goes to one, then he goes to the other, then he goes to the other. He always says, I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house down. He does, goes to the next one. So what you've got going on here is a bunch of things. It's really the motif of three, again and again and again. Three houses, three huts, and then every time the wolf goes there, he repeats the I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house down. So that becomes a motif. Three is one of the most common motifs that you're going to find in fairy tales. If you take another one, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And not only there are three bears, but then when she tries the bowls of porridge, there are three of them. There are three chairs. There are three beds. And when you take the porridge, the beds, and the chairs, there's really three different events that are going on in the story. So anytime you're reading a fairy tale, look for a motif, and there's a good chance that one of them is going to be the number three. All right, characters. You know characters. We've had characters in every story that you've ever read, and they're really important. There are different types of characters that we've got. Now, when you write a novel, you generally have a three-dimensional character. You have a character who's very much like a real human, somebody who might want one thing but be conflicted with another, and if I get this, will I have to give up that? They have moral decisions they need to make. In fairy tales, we tend to have more one-dimensional or flat characters. So it's one-dimensional and flat character are exactly the same thing. And it means that they have a single characteristic. So you might have something like a very hungry wolf, or you might have somebody who's always very quick to judge, or you might have somebody who's always angry or very jealous, and that's the one thing that drives that. Now, the other types of characters, as I said, are three-dimensional or rounded characters. They tend to be in modern literature, but they don't tend to show up so much in fairy tales. Fairy tales focus more on flat characters. Oops, sorry, one too many. Now, on the website, I put a link to a Japanese anime version of Hansel and Gretel. And I'm not going to play a video inside a video right now, but take a moment on the website and go back and watch this and look for some of the things we just talked about. Look for sprites or magical creatures. Look for supernatural occurrences. Look for the number 3. And look for a lesson in here somewhere. That wasn't one of the ones in the elements there, but specifically, but a lesson in a fairy tale is extremely common. All right, then you're going to read The White Snake. It's a very short story. It has an introduction and a body and a conclusion, like all stories should. In your Cornell notes, then, what you want to do is you want to make sure all of the characters are listed, because when you get to the end of the unit, you don't want to have to reread everything. So you want the notes to keep straight what was in each of the works that we read. Make a quick outline of the plot. This happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens is good enough. Look for the elements. When we get to the end of the unit, I'm going to give you different pieces of folk literature, and you're going to have to identify them by genre by looking for these elements. And this is the most important one for today. I want you to be able to identify any motifs that you see throughout The White Snake. Now, when you're finished with The White Snake, you can work with your group, or if you're making this assignment up late, you'll find in Schoology, you'll find the levels of thinking questions. I always like when you discuss them with someone else before you answer in your own words. I don't want you to just copy everybody else's answer, but listen, discuss, and then formulate your own answer to each question. And then finally, always examples, examples, examples. So don't say something like, this story is a fairy tale because it has 3 motifs. Show me what those motifs are. And that's going to be it for The White Snake, but that's not it for our study of fairy tales, because we're going to break into groups later and we're going to do a whole bunch of other, some really Grimm's Tale. So I'll see you then.